Good morning. This is the YouTube channel of the Study and Institute of IAS, and my name is Aman Jha. With today's lecture, we are going to start a new program called NCERT Concept Series. Concept Series. See, whenever a student starts preparation for competitive examinations and especially civil service examinations, the first thing they are told is to study the NCERTs back and forth comprehensively. However, reading NCERT is not only a perfunctory exercise, it's a very important stage in your preparation, and a good reading and good conceptual understanding of NCERT can very smoothly launch you into the next stage of reading, standard books. But what happens that since students mostly prepare NCERTs on their own, so they tend to miss important concepts since NCERTs are written for school children. So what they do, they mention certain ideas and messages, but the ideas are often not interlinked with each other. This especially happens in the lower class NCERTs in 6, 7, 8. But if we go through them minutely, we will realize that there are many gems of the ideas there. So we are trying to uncover those hidden gems and help you to develop a proper framework for studying NCERTs. And we are going to start with the history NCERTs in the class 6. So let's begin. See, a classical dilemma for anyone, even for students, is that why we should study history. So a utilitarian answer is that you should study history because it's part of your syllabus. And more important, but more important is that history plays a very important role in your overall development, overall development of your preparation, overall development of your personality, and overall development of your knowledge base. There is this classical line from a Hindi song that सिकंदर ने पोरस से की थी लड़ाई तो मैं क्या करूं. It's a fair, reasonable question. That okay, something happened in a very distant past, and a Greek invader came. He fought across West Asia, Central Asia, came up to the India's border, defeated few kings, and went back. Why should it bother us? What often we miss is that there were many significant long and short term impacts of Alexander's invasion. For example, Alexander's campaign linked the Mediterranean world with South Asia and China for the first time. Okay, new maritime and Silk Route and land routes were developed in the aftermath of Alexander's invasion. Due to the contact with Greco-Roman art, Gandhara school of art developed. Okay. Establishment of Mauryan Empire. Why? Because what happened due to Alexander's invasion in the northwestern part of the subcontinent, a kind of power vacuum and chaos was created. Benefiting from this chaos, Chandragupta Maurya and his very smart minister Chanakya started creation of Mauryan Empire. And perhaps most importantly, what happened that Alexander was accompanied by some historians, and using the accounts of those historians, other historians wrote many detailed accounts as well. So Alexander's historians maintained exact records, and using that record, it was identified that the Sandrocotus mentioned in Alexander's historian's account is actually Chandragupta Maurya. So we knew that Alexander was in India in around 326 BCE. Using this information, historians were able to create exact chronology of Indian Mauryan dynasty, and using that information, then they could create the exact chronology of entire ancient Indian history. So yes, it is indeed true that an event in far off history may not have direct relevance right now, but it had many tangible impacts. Therefore, studying history is something very similar. For example, history of great men isn't the only history. See, what happens that in modern times, history writing is influenced by two traditions. One is the Greco-Roman tradition, and another is Islamic tradition. And in both traditions of history writing, there was a lot of emphasis on the lives and times of great men and leaders like prophet, important kings, etc. So this habit of focusing on the lives and times of important individuals was inherited due to these two legacies. Then what happened that from individuals to political events, shift happened to individuals to political events, and then it the scope of history was further expanded by focusing on the lives of common people as well. So history isn't about great men only. However, we cannot say that political history and dates are totally irrelevant. Just as we saw in the previous slide that from the account of Alexander's historians, we came to know that Chandragupta Maurya, referred to as Sandrocotus in Greek accounts, had met him, and we know that he was here around 326 BC. So using that information, they created the exact chronology of entire ancient Indian history. Similarly, events like Ashoka's Kalinga War or Samudragupta's campaigns or the formation of Mahajanpads. So we cannot say that they are not irrelevant, but they are not as relevant as they used to be, and they are only one aspect of a very large scope. Also, history is one among many social sciences. The other are polity, economy, geography, etc. And all these are part of your syllabus. Now look, a key word here is sciences. We know there are two sorts of sciences: natural sciences, physics, chemistry, biology, microbiology, etc. And then there are social sciences: polity, economy, geography, history, etc. Look, history is not an art. What it means that it is a science, not an art, meaning it is a rational discipline. Studying history is a rational exercise. Your sources of study, your interpretations have to be rational. They have to adhere to certain rational parameters. You cannot write poems and call it a history. Okay, so it is a social science, though often history is taught in Bachelor of Arts or Master of Arts courses, but it's not an art, it's actually a science. It is as scientific as economy, as scientific as polity. Also, history isn't one but many. Why? Because as we just saw that history is not only about great men, it is not only about political events, it's also about many social, economic and cultural changes. More importantly, the experience of different social classes and genders has been different. For example, a large section of people do not accept that ancient India was a golden period, because due to their disenfranchisement, for them modern time has been better than ancient India. Also, there are many sections like women who have been neglected in the study of ancient period. There are areas which are neglected, say northeast. So there are multiple histories. There is not one history. Okay, there could be history of political events, there could be history of religious developments, there could be a history of social exploitation. Okay, a history of a ruling class will be different from a history of farming class. A history of traders could be different from history of forest dwellers. So we have to remember and develop a sort of tolerance for different sorts of interpretation of history. We cannot say, oh, that history is not important and this history is more important, because just because modern political ideas are more accepting of one interpretation over the other. So history is not one but many. And also, often new narratives come up. These narratives, though based on evidence, but if evidence change or if evidence undergo another interpretation or the interpretation change, then new narratives will come up. For example, a classic example is studying partition. Earlier what we used to do, we used to study the causes of partition mainly to fix accountability, that who was accountable for partition. Was it INC? Was it League? Was it colonial government? But now what has happened, the emphasis and focus has shifted to the experiences of partition, how different communities experience partition, how especially women, how women underwent a significant trauma due to partition. So, and there is many latest literature that recounts those accounts of horrors of partition and the accompanying violence. Therefore, these are some of the common ideas behind history, studying a history in a rational manner. That is, though political history and dates are important, but they are only one aspect of a larger group of issues. Then history is a science, it is not an art. Your interpretation and your study has to be rational. Also, for different groups, history could be different. For upper caste, forward caste, history could be different, but for marginalized and lower classes, history could be different. For one, it could be, it could invoke nostalgia. For another, it could invoke pain. And as new evidence come up, okay, new narratives will come up. As old evidence are reinterpreted, new narratives can also come up. So now let's start with the history of class 6th. Okay, it's called Our Past, part 1, part 2 is in class 7th, part 3 is in class 8th. Here is the index. What broadly happens is that this chapter focuses on sources. Remember how we talked about that history is a social science, it is not an art, meaning you have to study and interpret history rationally, and to do that you need sources to study history. Okay, some of your sources are primary, some of your sources are secondary, some of your sources are based on literature, and some are based on archaeology. We will see the exact definition of them in later chapters. And then we have On the Trail of Earliest People, from gathering to growing food. This talks about Stone Age. In the earliest cities, this talks about Harappan period. What books and burials tells us? Vedic age. And then you have, you can call this period Mahajanpad age or Buddha age. Mahajanpad age or Buddha age. Then you have about Mauryan Empire. Especially it talks about Ashoka. Then these segments talk about non-political developments and in social developments in social, economic and cultural spheres of life during this period. This talks about Gupta period, which is the end of Gupta period marks the end of ancient history, and then early medieval period starts. Buildings, typical, a synopsis of developments in art and culture during the ancient period. So this is the overall this is the overview of your class 6 NCERT. Then first chapter, what, where, how and when. See, the beauty of NCERT is that it tries to look at things from the viewpoint of children. Okay, and since it is a 6th class NCERT, so which often happens that they discuss very crucial ideas, but they don't go into details of it, because after all they have written it for children. So they will put up an idea and let the children absorb it without going into the intricacies, without going into the linkages with other topics. Something similar happens here. What it says in the first on the first page itself, that Rashida, and they always start with from the perspective of a child, sat reading the newspaper. Suddenly her eyes fell on a small headline, 100 years ago. How she wondered, could anyone know what had happened so many years ago? The answer to that, this is not actually given in NCERT, we have prepared it. The answer to that is sources. Your question is, how could anyone know what happened so many years ago? And your answer is sources. Why? To repeat my previous statement, history is a social sciences. It studies society in a scientific manner. It is a rational discipline. It is not liberal arts where you can conjure up history as you want. Okay, we can use religious text or folk tales to construct history. Religious text, folk tales, or the inscriptions of kings and queens, or the bardic words, they are not history. They are only a source for constructing history. What you do, you use different types of sources to construct a narrative in history. Okay, so what, where, how, and when? To answer all these questions, for whichever age you are studying, you need sources. Now, how can we know about the past? Means about sources. So there are two types of sources. One is literary source, another is archaeological source. They have mentioned a word, manuscript. Manuscript in the book. Manu means, it's a Latin word, hand, and script in written, means handwritten work. So something written with hands, a written source. Okay, it could be either in the form of a book, or it could be on a hard surface. You can call them literary sources. Now there are a variety of literary sources. For example, it could be a religious work. Now obviously printing did not exist in pre-modern era, so each new copy was handmade. Okay, now you could do it on a bark leaf tree, on a bark tree leaves, then palm leaves you could use. You can do it on a hard surface like Ashokan inscriptions, etc. The paper has come up in the medieval era, so writing on paper is a medieval phenomena. In ancient times, there was no such thing as paper. It could be a religious source, or it could be anything written on secular issues, something like Arthashastra, something like Charak Samhita, Sushruta Samhita. Okay, so your theme could be religious or your theme could be secular. Even among religious texts, there is a large variety. There are Vedic literature. There is Vedic literature, there is Buddhist literature. Among Vedas, there are 4 Vedas: Rigved, Samved, Yajurved, Atharved. Then you have Brahmanas, Aranyakas, Upanishads. Entire thing is called Vedic corpus. You have Buddhist text, you have Jain sources. So, when we say a religious literature, it means it mainly talks about religious ideas, but using that religious text, we can construct history. We do not accept them at the face value, but we use information from them, tally them with other sources and construct a historical narrative. How do we use religious sources? We will study in the later chapters. Okay. Mahabharata, Ramayana, epics, they will be counted in religious sources, literary sources. Especially in literary, they are religious sources. Among secular, I gave examples. So, first type of sources is literary sources. Then you have archaeological sources. Things, artifacts, tools, etc. Especially material remains. These can be counted as archaeological sources. If you dig up a ruined city, that is your archaeological source. If you dig up a pot or a weight or a bead, so things that you discover in archaeological excavations, they are archaeological sources. Okay. we will see how different sources are used, sometimes on their own, sometimes together. We will see in later chapters. Then there are some sources like inscriptions. Right? Those inscriptions, they could be written on a stone surface like Ashokan inscriptions, or they could be written on a copper plate. Okay, copper plate inscriptions. So you have a permanent record. See, what happens is that, now imagine, why would you write something on a solid surface? It's a very difficult thing to do, either a stone or a copper plate. Writing on a palm leaf or a birch leaf, it's easy, but it is perishable. So it will erode, it will be eaten by termites. So chances are that your records will not last that long. But if you inscribe on a stone surface, or if you inscribe on a copper plate, then it will stay in perpetuity. Now today we have your cloud. So you have Google Cloud. If you can store it in Google Cloud, and Google takes guarantee that your data will be protected. But there was no Google at that time. So to preserve the information that you are inscribing in perpetuity, you use such surfaces. So inscriptions, you have something written on a hard surface. Now, and often these inscriptions are found archaeologically, during archaeological excavations, these are found. So there are certain hybrid sources like inscriptions that once they are discovered during archaeological excavations, they are studied, okay, they prepared a critical edition of it, and then they translate it, and then they study it. However, correspondence between archaeological and literary sources is often very difficult. Now, what is correspondence between archaeological and literary sources? See, there are a couple of challenges. One, there will be cases where you will only have literary source but no archaeological source. For example, to study the Vedic Aryans, you only have literary sources. That means Vedic corpus. You have 4 Vedas, and basis on those some Ved Samhitas, you have Brahmanas, you have Aranyakas, and you have Upanishads. But you do not have any archaeological source to study Vedic Aryans or Vedic society. Then there are, so you will have literature only. Obviously, it creates the narrative based on literature only will be incomplete. Then there are some cases where you have archaeological sources only. To study the people of Stone Age, Paleolithic, Mesolithic, Neolithic, you only have archaeological sources. Then there are examples like Harappan civilization, where you have found the script, but you cannot decipher it. So even though you have literary source, you cannot decipher it. So in that case, you only have archaeological sources. And then there is third problem of correspondence. That means the information derived from literary source and information derived from archaeological source should, be congruous. They should confirm what both of them are saying. Okay, you should be able to use archaeological source to confirm what literary source is saying, and vice versa. But often this correspondence becomes difficult. For example, we have Arthashastra. Okay, it's a source for Mauryan Empire. Obviously, good guess, literary source. And then you have archaeological excavations, especially of ancient Patliputra near about the modern Patna. Okay, in archaeological excavations, they have found pillared halls and fortifications in near Patna. But in Arthashastra, Mauryan Empire is nowhere mentioned. We know Arthashastra was written by Chanakya, who was a minister of Chandragupta Maurya, and on the basis of Arthashastra, we derive information about the Mauryan administration, the officials, the Mauryan economy, the Mauryan polity. However, it does not mention Mauryan Empire. Okay. Similarly, in excavations at Patliputra near modern Patna, we do not find any concrete evidence that it was indeed, though time frame are similar, that excavations do belong to Mauryan age, but we do not find any written material like inscription which says that this is the palace of Mauryan kings. So often the correspondence between literary and archaeological sources becomes difficult. And then, despite history being social sciences, it depends very, substantively on sciences. For example, carbon dating. Now you excavated something, okay, in an archaeological excavation. Now, is it a pure source or is it some spurious source? Somebody lost it there much later. So, to identify the exact age of an artifact, you have to do carbon dating. Aerial surveillance, GPS, and many such, you have this pollen studies. There are many other scientific disciplines that are used as supplements of archaeological as well as literary sources. You have philologists or linguistics that study the commonality or differences between different languages. I mean, they have come up with the idea of a common family of Indo-European languages. On one side, you have European languages, on other side Indo-Aryan Iranian languages. Within Indo-Iranian languages, you have Iranian languages and Indian languages. So, what these linguistic studies help us to create a understanding that the Vedic Aryans, the language they spoke was the progeny or ancestor of the many modern languages. So, often sciences are used to clearly understand literary and archaeological sources. And most importantly, often these sources were created by, for groups that were at the forefront of history: kings, traders, intellectual class, scribes. But what about farmers, hunters, forest dwellers? Okay, what about uneducated people? How can an uneducated class that did not have a sense of writing would leave a written source of its history? So often, what we do, we try to understand the history of marginalized groups on the basis of these sources. For example, Fahian, who visited India during the Gupta Empire, he talked about the pathetic conditions in which the untouchables lived. Though it is a source created by a Buddhist monk, a literary source, but using that we try to understand the lives of marginalized groups as well. Okay, in Ashokan inscription, Ashoka gives a dire warning to the forest dwellers that they should live a disciplined life. So, using such indirect inferences, we try to understand the history of marginalized groups as well. Another classification is primary and secondary source. A primary source can be crudely called an eyewitness account, okay, something that belonged to the same period. So once you excavate an archaeological site and if you have discovered a pottery that belonged to the same period, okay, for example, the Harappan seals or the Harappan cities, they are primary source. Okay, Arthashastra it's a primary source. But Kalhan's Raj Tarangani, in which he writes about the history of the kings of Kashmir. Some of the kings may have lived centuries before Kalhan. That is a secondary source. That means a secondary source is based on primary sources. So we can crudely understand primary source as an eyewitness account. See, both literary as well as archaeological sources could be primary source. And on the basis of primary sources, secondary sources are created. Okay. For example, Kalhan's Raj Tarangani would be a secondary source. Often during Mughal period and during the period of Delhi Sultanate, historians used to write the history of Mughal Empire or a certain Delhi dynasty from the time of the advent of Islam in India. So it would be a primary source for the Mughal Empire. However, if you want to study centuries before that, then it will become a secondary source for that period. That means you were not there, you used some other source to construct the history of that period. Okay. And see, this is an inscription. At the end of the book, at the end of the chapter, they have mentioned this Rosetta Stone. Rosetta is a place in northern Egypt near the coastline, and they say that this inscription was found, and this inscription was bilingual, both in Egyptian as well as Greek. So you would assume that same thing is written first in Egyptian and then in Greek as well. Now people knew Greek, so using that they deciphered the Egyptian hieroglyph script, and they have been able to understand the ancient Egyptian culture. Unfortunately, such fortunate discovery has not happened in the case of Harappan civilization. So we do know that Harappans had a script, but we have not been able to decipher it. And there is an interesting story to it. Actually, when Napoleon invaded Egypt, because he wanted to cut off the route to India for British Empire, one of the soldiers of Napoleonic army discovered this Rosetta Stone. So this is an example of inscription. This is an inscription. Okay. They are often discovered during archaeological excavations, and it's a written matter. In India, in later classes, you will often study about copper plate inscriptions. What they do to keep records in perpetuity, they used to inscribe on copper plates. Also, what can we know about the past? This was how can we know about the past? So answer to how is sources. That using literary and archaeological sources and some sciences, using primary and secondary sources, we can know about the past. And then comes what can we know about the past? You see, whenever you are studying a certain period of history, be it Neolithic society or Gupta society, Mughal period, whichever period you are studying, you study mainly along 5 dimensions, which are economy, economic situation, political situation, social situation, social structures, household, social hierarchies, gender relations, cultural beliefs, values, practices, and religion. So these are the 5 broad areas along which we study any particular time period. Okay. Some new dimensions are coming up as well. For example, gender relations. Normally what used to happen, that whenever they were studying the social condition of any period, they would simply put a subheading called the condition of woman, as if it was separate and insulated from other areas. But it has been realized using sociological and anthropological studies that economic relations and political structures have deep impact over the condition of women in society. The artificial, the dichotomy or separation between household and public life is actually very artificial. So the condition of women in society reflects the condition of women in the household. Okay, the institutions like marriage, inheritance, such an individual freedom, etc., they not only reflect the social relations but public relations as well. So they have undertook a separate. They have often especially the feminist historiography, they have developed a separate dimension called gender relations. But still, primarily we are studying an history of any period along these 5 dimensions. Okay, then what we had seen in the index comes up again, that what can we know? So we know along 5 dimensions, And we know about these periods. Hunter-gatherers means they hunted and gathered their food, they did not practice agriculture. Then comes the Neolithic age. So to know about them, what are our sources? Mostly tools. Even amongst tools, stone tools. Okay. To know about Neolithic people, I am mentioning sources. Stone tools plus other agriculture related sources. Which sources we will study in specific chapter. So I am mentioning sources. What can we know? We can know along 5 dimensions about these periods. In each of the periods, we will explore 5 dimensions of the period. Okay. And here I am mentioning the sources for knowing about them. Urbanization, meaning Harappan civilization, first urbanization as well as second urbanization. Here for some period we only have archaeological sources, but here literary sources start as well. Now we get literary as well as archaeological sources. See, for Stone Age means for this period where people were not using metals, they were using stone tools. We cannot have literary sources because though people spoke languages, they did not have script. See, there is a difference between language and script. All the Indian scripts have emerged from one single Brahmi script. But Indian languages broadly belong to 3 categories. First, that Indo-European languages we talked about. Second, Austro-Asiatic in certain parts of Central India. And then we have Dravidian languages. So languages of India belong to 3 categories. But script, all the Indian scripts have emerged from one single Brahmi script. So starting with the urbanization. In the case of first urbanization, we do have literary source, but the problem is we cannot decipher it. Okay. But from the second urbanization, we have literary sources that can be deciphered as well as we have archaeological sources as well. Before that, only archaeological source. For Mauryan empires, we have inscriptions like Mauryan inscription, we all know. And then we have literary sources. Among literary sources, we have religious literature as well as secular literature. Secular literature means Arthashastra, Megasthenes Indica, accounts of Greek scholars that visited India or the traders, etc. Among religious, we have Buddhist sources. We even have Brahminical sources. Okay. For example, often Brahminical sources refer to the low social origin of Mauryas, whereas Buddhist sources refer to the high social origin of Mauryas. And starting from this period, we have both literary as well as archaeological evidence. See, the point I am trying to highlight here is what can we know? So we can know along 5 dimensions about each of these period. Okay. Then second chapter is, this is chapter second. The first chapter was what, where, how about sources. Okay. On the trail of earliest people. See, the evidence of the presence of human beings in the Indian subcontinent goes as far back as 2 millennium ago. Million years ago, this is in short we write, okay? Million years ago. Now we are all aware of out of Africa theory that pre-humans as well as modern humans called Homo sapiens emerged from the Africa and then they scattered outwards. So the evidence of the presence of humans go as far as 2 million years ago. However, these people did not live in cities. These people did not even practice agriculture. Rather, they were hunters and gatherers. What did they do? They hunted and gathered their food. See, it's a very strange thing that for any other period, we have Mughal period, means people We have Delhi Sultanate period, we have Gupta period, we have Mauryan period. Everywhere else we demarcate a period on the basis of an dynastical, a political dynasty or a political empire, etc. Okay, or a great being like Buddha, so we call Buddha age. We find out Mahajanpad age because that was the first time that large kingdoms come up. This is the only phase which is named after how people gathered their food. Why? Because the society was so primitive at this stage that all the political institutions did not, the political institutions like kingship, empire, etc., they did not exist. They can only come up in more sophisticated society. Early humans were hunters and gatherers, means they hunted, obviously you will hunt animals, and gathered their food. Gathering, what would they gather? Fruits, okay, grains, etc. In Stone Age, basically, we have three categories: Paleolithic, Mesolithic, and Neolithic. Paleo means old, Neo means new, and between old and new we have Meso, means a period of transition. All the three form part of the Stone Age. Why? Because people did not use metal, they only used stones to make their tools. Now, as they did not practice agriculture and only hunted and gathered their food, they had to move regularly. And why they had to move? They had to move because obviously if you stay at a place for a very long period and since you are not growing your food, you will eventually exhaust your food sources. Okay, the local animals you will hunt all of them, animals will run away. You would have exhausted all the fruit sources, grain sources. Also with change in season, you have to move from winter to summer area, from summer to winter area in your migrations. Also, as your animals move, you have to chase them, you have to follow them. Okay, so there was no incentive to stay at a one place for a prolonged period. In fact, staying at a one place for a longer period was actually harmful for the existence. So this is the reasons they moved regularly. Now during Stone Age, stone tools are the only source. Okay, and how do we know about them? What are our sources? Stone tool, see, only their tools. Now you can say that tools belong to the category of archaeological sources. Since they did not have a script, therefore there is no scope for a literary source. You will only have archaeological source. Okay, among archaeological source, since people did not live permanently at a place, you will not have cities, you will not have sophisticated items like pot, etc. So only tools are available. Now it is believed that they had at least three types of tools: wooden tools, bone tools, and stone tools. Among these, obviously bone tools and wooden tools would erode. Okay, so there is no possibility of them surviving for thousands of years. They would be disintegrate under erosion, etc. Okay, they will decompose. You see, wood and bones, what happens? They decompose practically. Only stone tools, therefore among three types of tools only stone tools have survived. There is a historian called Yuval Noah Harari. He says that actually the Stone Age should be called the Wooden Age, because the logic says that it's much easier to use wood. Wood is more pliable than stones, but the wood will decompose much sooner. Bones might take some time longer. So only source is their stone tools, and since the only way to study them is stone tools, On the basis of changes in the nature of stone tools, the Stone Age has been classified into Paleolithic, Mesolithic and Neolithic. Paleolithic means old stone tools, Neolithic means new stone tools, and then you have a period of transition between these two periods. Okay, what do we know? We can infer about 5 dimensions, means what about their subsistence pattern, their social structure, their cultural beliefs and values, and political institutions. See, using your tools, now depending upon their variety or changes, we have, if you have core tools, this could be called, you have core tools, flake tools, blades, they are called for Paleolithic age. Then if you have microliths, we will go into the details of how, why, which tool, why macroliths are appeared. Then you have Mesolithic age, and if you have polished stone tools, things which are used in agriculture, pestle, mortar, which are still used in some of the villages, you will have Neolithic society that practiced agriculture. Okay, so Paleolithic, Mesolithic and Neolithic. Also, what can we know about them? For example, using their tool, you can know their subsistence base, what they hunted, what they gathered, okay, their subsistence pattern. Now, you know that using stone tools, you can only hunt so much, you can only gather so much. So, that restricts the population size, okay. Your subsistence level restricts your population size. That below that, above that level, the available level of resources would not sustain the population. On the basis of which you can say that these people lived in band societies, means small bands of people, okay, 50 to 100 people. And could an elaborate political structure emerge in such small societies? Obviously not. It will be mostly egalitarian. Their religious and cultural practices would be simpler. So, due to these reasons, based on stone tools, using stone tools, you can identify along 5 dimensions. These things will be studied in more detail in your regular lectures on general studies and optional classes. But for right now, understand only this much, that we only have one type of source for these periods, stone tools, and using tools we identify themes along 5 dimensions. Now, Mesolithic period. First we saw Paleolithic period, okay, old stone tools. Then comes the Mesolithic period, and it comes because of the climate change. However, the difference between this climate change and the climate change we are experiencing right now is that this was a natural climate change and the current one is anthropogenic. Around 12,000 years ago, okay, the last ice age, Pleistocene epoch, ended and Holocene epoch started. Now you must have heard, you have first era, then you have period, you have epoch. In era you have Paleozoic era, Mesozoic era, Cenozoic era, then you have period, and then you have epoch. So Pleistocene epoch was last ice age, and around 12,000 years ago Pleistocene epoch ended and Holocene epoch began. This was the climate change, deglaciation. Now, since ice age ended, climate became warmer and wetter. That means more precipitation and more temperature. Due to these two reasons, there was proliferation of flora and fauna. Okay, obviously if the climate is more wetter, you will have more grassland, you will have more forest, you will have more water. Therefore, the animal as well as plant life will thrive because of it. It will go into the new ecological niches. So, due to climatic changes, there was proliferation of flora and fauna. Also, due to warmer weather, you can see the erosion of rocks. Now, you will read that in geography, that how a warmer and wetter climate leads to more erosion of rocks. New types of stone tools could be made called microliths. These were small, very sometimes as small as few centimeters, often triangular in shape. Okay, so these were small rocks, microliths, micro means small, that were fitted into saw, sickles and arrows. So you will have a wooden arrow and then you will fit it as the arrowhead. Okay, you will have a wooden stick and then you will fit it at the top of the wooden stick in the form of arrowhead. So these two changes, proliferation of flora and fauna and appearance of new tools called microliths, marks the transition from Paleolithic to Mesolithic period. And this is a transition phase between hunting and food gathering to food production. Hunting and food gathering, a phenomena of Paleolithic age; food production, a phenomena of Neolithic age. So Mesolithic age is a transition phase, as improving understanding of flora and fauna helped in the ushering in of Neolithic age. See, as there was proliferation of flora and fauna, people could study it, understand it more. Often many of the features of Neolithic age are seen at some of the sites of Mesolithic age as well. So remember this, it's a phase of transition between Paleolithic and Neolithic age. Some important archaeological sites are given. Now see, if they have given these sites in NCERT, 6th class NCERT, so you can imagine that there could be a question in prelims on the basis of it. For example, Burj Home is a very famous Neolithic site. We will study what are Neolithic sites. Mehergarh, perhaps the most important Neolithic site of subcontinent at this point. Chirand, Koldheva, Mahagara, Bhimbetka. So at least go through this. Hunsgi, it's an important Paleolithic site. Go through this map and just understand the classification. They have given Paleolithic, Mesolithic, Neolithic, Megalithic, early villages and modern cities. This is obviously not important, but there could be a prelims question that they will say which of the following are, say, they will give you three options. Hunsgi, 1, they will give Mehergarh, and they will give Chirand, for example, and say which of the three sites are Paleolithic sites. Now Hunsgi is a Paleolithic site, okay, but Mehergarh is a Neolithic site here, and Chirand in Bihar, this is also a Neolithic site. So your answer will be only 1. Also, art and culture. See, what is art and culture? It is a way of expressing yourself. All right. Even Stone Age people, once they were done hunting and gathering and they had spare time, human beings have this inherent desire to express themselves. Okay. So when they were sitting idle, what they will do? They will sing songs. They will sing songs. They will dance. Okay. They will create pictures, paintings. But now we do not know which songs they created. We do not know which dance they performed, on which occasions, okay, in which manner. What roles did women and men play in those dances and songs? What has survived among the arts and cultures of Stone Age people is their cave paintings, especially in the areas like Bhimbetka. It is in Madhya Pradesh, Narmada Valley, and then in southern Uttar Pradesh, Belan Valley. So there would be many arts and cultures that Stone Age people performed, but we have this one surviving one. Also, areas like Sundargarh and Sambalpur in Odisha also have a variety of stone cave paintings. Now, using the themes of these cave paintings, themes like hunting scenes, there is a huge variety in hunting scenes as well. Okay. Sometimes the people are chasing animals. Sometimes they are chasing animals mounted on horses. Then sometimes animals are chasing people. Then you have dancing scenes. Sometimes you have scenes in which people are performing day-to-day household chores. Okay. Some of the paintings are rather difficult to decipher. They could have ritualistic significance. They could have some religious value. Also, often the paintings are, created at rather inaccessible places where you have to build scaffolding to reach there. You have to create fire to give light because the sun rays would not come that far inside the cave. So it is possible that some of the cave paintings have ritualistic and as well as religious value. Some are simple expression of yourself. Okay, you were sitting there, you were doing nothing, so you doodled something. But some of them certainly have some religious value. Okay. And then from gathering to growing. People gathered during Paleolithic age and people grew during Neolithic age. Neolithic means new stone tools. Remember, the only source to study Stone Age is stone tools, as the name suggests. Due to changes in type and application of stone tools, the Stone Age is further classified into Paleolithic, Mesolithic and Neolithic. Neolithic is this last one. Now, Mesolithic age was a transition period, as we saw in the previous slide. Now, there is a diffusion theory which discusses that why people started growing food. What was the inspiration? What motivated them to grow food? Was it because population increased so much that they could not sustain themselves by gathering food? Or was there some other reason? So, there is this one body of opinion which is represented in the diffusion theory. What it says, that there were certain core areas in the world. Core areas in the world. Core areas like modern day Turkey, Syria, Golden Crescent. Areas like Mesoamericas. Areas like Thailand, Asia, areas like Balochistan and Vidyan Spurs. That where agriculture started, and from these core areas the agricultural practices spread to other areas. So it diffused, the practice of agriculture diffused to other areas. So a transition period. What happened in transition period? That in Mesolithic period, that people started a kind of animal domestication, a kind of production. Not exactly. For example, we have studied that due to the proliferation, due to changes in climate, there was proliferation of flora and fauna. Now, if suppose you have a large number of sheep and goats in your area, you don't necessarily domesticate them, but you control their movement. Okay, you create large pens around them. You constantly monitor them, guard them, do not let them escape. Similarly, since new grains were growing, wild grains were growing much more and much closer to human habitations and in new areas. So people understood and observed that during which season what happened. That even obviously now wheat has a cycle, that sowing cycle, and when the seeds are sown, when they are irrigated, when they are harvested. So people, though this is after domestication, but people must have realized that there is a cyclicity in growth of wheat or such other vegetables or rice. So during Mesolithic period, they observed these things and started kind of proto new agriculture. This must have happened in some of the core areas under diffusion theory, and from there the knowledge of agriculture spread to new areas. Also, how? Now the question comes that apart from stone tools, some new sources also come up to study the Neolithic period. For example, if there is a Neolithic settlement where you have grains, especially charred grains, because raw grains would not survive, they will decompose very soon, but charred grains will survive for a long period. So you study them. If they are charred, they will survive. However, is the grain of wild variety? Is the grain wild or domesticated? That is also a question, right? So if it is a wild grain, then you say no, people were gathering but they were not growing, so it is not a Neolithic site yet. But if it is a domesticated grain, now how can you tell a certain species is wild or domesticated? Basically there are you know, anatomical changes in the shapes of their different body parts. This is more pronounced in the case of animals. For you must have seen wild buffalo and the domesticated buffalo. Okay, the difference between them is very there are morphological changes in their body structure. Similarly, there are tiny morphological changes in the grains as well. You can tell whether this grain was domestic or wild variety of grain. Similarly, if you find animal bones of sheep, goat, pigs, cattle, bones of these animals, now you can tell whether it was a domesticated animal or a wild animal. Okay. So if you find, so apart from stone tools, you have these new sources. Okay. The bones of domesticated animals and charred grains of domestic variety. These are your new sources. See what used to happen, that suppose these animal ate grass. Okay. Now due to climatic changes during Mesolithic period, there will be a grassland will grow larger in size and animals will like to remain around the grassland. What humans will do, that they will restrict their movement, that yes, they should be able to eat the grass but they should not be able to escape it. So this is a kind of transition period. It is only much later that humans started intentionally breeding animals. When you intentionally start breeding animals, you intentionally look after their day-to-day needs, then you have domesticated the animal. Similarly, due to proliferation of grains, they could collect grain. Okay, they could clear the area so that the grain could automatically grow there. But it is only when they started using these seeds from to grow next crop, it is only then you can say now agriculture has started. So from a transition period to Neolithic period started. Now how do we know about them? Sources, as we said, charred grains, animal bones. But you have to ensure that they are domesticated variety. You study their morphological features and understand depending upon their teeth, their horns, their size of their backbone, etc. You can say whether it's a domesticated species or wild species. Evidence of continuous habitation. Now since people started agriculture, okay, that means they could stay at a place for a longer period and they would not have to move because now they are growing their own food. What they need some water, fertile land. If a place has water and fertile land, you should be able to irrigate it and grow food for yourself. You could also, if a place has if you can domesticate animals, then you don't have to move now anymore. So people started living. In fact, when we say Mesolithic period is a phase of transition, what happened even during Mesolithic phase, we had semi-permanent villages. There are evidences from many sites where that tells us that people had already started living in semi-permanent villages because now there was abundance of food. So you could live at a place longer than usual. Continuous habitations. From this, villages appeared. Okay. First villages, you can say, appeared during the Neolithic period. Remember this line. First villages appeared during the Neolithic period. Okay. So apart from your stone tools like polished axes, you have polished axes. This is the hallmark of Neolithic age because it will be used in many of the agricultural practices. Mortars and pestles which are still used to grind grains. Now, so stone tools and typical Neolithic things like continuous habitation, grains, bones. you have other sources. Sources like pottery and later granary. You grow food, you grow crop, you domesticated animal, you slaughter them and store them. Where would you store them? You need pottery for that, right? Where will you store your grain? Now you harvested grain, you consume some of it, you keep it for lean seasons, and then you keep some more so that you can grow the next crop. For all that activity, for cooking, for example, you need pottery. And once you have started growing sufficient amount of grain, now you need granary, godowns to store your food. Okay, so these are the signs of a Neolithic village. Areas like Balochistan, okay, for example, Mehergarh was possibly the first Neolithic site in India, and southern Uttar Pradesh, especially the spurs of Vindhya mountains in Allahabad, Prayagraj districts, Mirzapur, Belan River Valley. Here you have some of the earliest Neolithic sites. Now, we mentioned certain sources to study Neolithic period. We talked about stone tools, remains of grains and bones. We had pottery. We talked about granary, polished axe, mortar, pestle. Okay. Using these sources, what can we understand about the intangible elements of culture? See, culture has two broad area: tangible and intangible. For tangible elements of culture, using the material sources or archaeological sources is enough. But to study intangible, these are intangible things. Subsistence pattern. Now you can use sources to infer about. See, you are drawing inference. That means you are trying to, using the sources, you try, okay, this person, this was a society where people, what was their subsistence pattern? Meaning what they ate, okay, what they grew, what occupations they practiced, how they sustained themselves. Also, obviously if you have bones of domesticated animals and grains, you can identify which crops they grew, which animals they domesticated, so you can decide what kind of economic practices they conducted. Also, if in a certain area you see a certain kind of tool that was not locally which cannot be made from locally available raw material, that means it was traded between different communities. Okay, so you can identify their trade. Socio-cultural values, if you see a, say, necklace of animal horns, for example, it will tell you that people had some sort of aesthetic sense as well. Also, a good theory is that since starting from Neolithic age, when people started farming, that was the period when people must have started worrying about future. For a hunter-gatherer society, present is everything. There is no point in worrying about future. You have all the food in present. But for a farming society, worrying about future becomes an inherent practice. You are constantly worried about the quality of rain, about the fertility of land, about whether there will be a termite attack or not, how will be whether would there be a hailstorm, what would be the quality of crops. So worrying about future, okay, worshipping the elements of nature that were important for your economic activity, for example, rain. So due to change in your subsistence pattern, there must have been change in socio-cultural values, okay, change in religious beliefs and values. For example, praying to gods, whichever god people prayed, that let there be enough rain, please there be no pest attack. Then the idea of private property. Now when you are growing crop on land, you must demarcate your land, where whichever grow, whatever the amount quantity of the crop that belongs to you. So such changes in socio-cultural values must have happened due to the Neolithic revolution. Then you have political structures. Now you know that people started living in villages. Okay. Earlier they only had pottery, but then when they grew enough grain, now you have to store them, and someone must protect granary. Otherwise, what if a different tribe or village steals your grain? So, to protect your granary, someone must exercise political power. So, here on, rudimentary political structures must have started appearing. Things like chiefs, chieftains that controlled a particular village, that controlled access to granary, who will get how much grain. And as we said, since farming communities had new concerns, okay, so there would be change in their faiths and beliefs as well. So these are inference basically, not concrete truths, but inference about the intangible elements of culture based on the sources. This table was given in the book. They have mentioned what kind of grains and bones were discovered from which site. Now you don't have to remember all of this, but do remember important Neolithic sites. Okay, Mehergarh in Balochistan, Koldihwa in present day Uttar Pradesh. Then you have Mahagara, again same Bilan Valley, Gufkral Burjhom in Kashmir. You have Bihar, Hallur, Andhra, Payampalli, Andhra. So there could be a question that which of the following is our Neolithic sites. As we saw, Burjhom is in Kashmir Valley, Chirand is in Bihar, Hallur you saw here. See, this was Hallur, it was in Andhra. So your answer will be all three. They have mentioned Mehergarh. Specifically, they have mentioned Mehergarh in this book. They say it's the earliest village settlement. Where is it? Balochistan. Based on the available evidence, we can say that this was the earliest Neolithic village in the Indian subcontinent. This was the place where the agriculture was practiced earliest, one of the core regions of the world. Now, what sort of evidence have they found? They have found charred wheat grains, barley, sheep, goat, deer, pigs, the domesticated varieties. They also have square and rectangular houses, okay? And some of them are rather big, 4 or 5 rooms, and some of the rooms are used as, granary. At one place, they saw that a goat was buried with human. Now, a goat was buried with a human. Now, what could be the reason behind it? Was it because that goat was a pet of the human? Or was it because they thought that this person is going from this world to another and there he or she might be hungry, so let's sacrifice a goat with him? Whatever be the thinking, but it's a reflection of social values. Now we cannot tell exactly which value, but burying a goat or an animal, for example, there is we mentioned this place Burjhom. Now here we have evidence of dog burial, a dog being buried along with a human. Now, was it because the dog was the pet of that human? Or was it because they both died together? Or was it to exercise some sort of spirit? We don't know. But we can tell from these practices that people believed in afterlife. Okay? People believed in life after death and they wanted to look after their dead ones. So, using the sources of Neolithic period, we can infer about the intangible elements of their culture. So, this is the end of lecture 1. We will see the rest of the chapters in the next lecture. Thank you.